Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Graeme Roy, a Professor of Economics at the University of Glasgow and a Senior Fellow here at the Centre for Public Policy at the University. We're delighted to be partnering with the Institute for Fiscal Studies today to bring you this webinar, taking a close look at the party's tax and spending plans ahead of the Holyrood election next week. The Centre for Public Policy was established at the University of Glasgow just over 2 years ago as a convening space that brings together academia, policymakers and practitioners to help tackle the complex and interconnected challenges facing government and the communities they serve. And we do this by driving forward policy-relevant research, building connections and developing skills and capability for the next generation of policymakers. And during this election campaign, the Centre has been doing a power of work to support informed debate and provide expert analysis on key developments. This includes our weekly Spotlight episodes, the most recent of which we discussed the economy, a series of policy insights on some of the most pressing challenges facing the next Scottish Government, and a programme of election-focused webinars like today, the first of which was last week on the cost of living. And you can access a recording of this via the QR code on the screen. And you can find information about all these activities and more on the Centre for Public Policy website. And please do get in touch if you'd like to learn more about our work. Now today though, we're delighted to bring you expert analysis in partnership with our colleagues at the Institute of Fiscal Studies. And we're going to look at the tax and spending plans of the main political parties standing in next week's election, a topic which has been high on the media agenda in recent days. Now, as everybody knows, the IFS is the UK's leading independent economics research institute, and over many years has established a powerful reputation for their analysis of party manifestos in and up to the UK general elections, and it's fantastic they are turning that attention and that intellectual rigour to the Scottish and the Welsh elections. At a time of major structural change, tight fiscal constraint and diminishing trust in political processes and institutions, it's all the more important that we have an independent analysis of manifesto commitments to not only ensure that the electorate is informed before they cast their votes, but to hold policymakers to account post-election for the promises and the commitments that they have made. So the format of today is that we'll hear from our speakers who will offer their reflections on the funding outlook facing the next Scottish Parliament and the tax, spending and social security plans of the main parties. But we're really keen for you to have the opportunity to pose questions to our speakers. There are two ways that you can ask your question. If you're on YouTube, you can comment in the chat. An alternative, we're using Slido. Now to access Slido, go to slido.com and then enter the code in the chat that's on the screen. Or alternatively, you can scan the QR code, which will also display for you. We also are on LinkedIn and Blue Sky, so if you would prefer to use that format, then please pose your question in. We will try to get around those questions as well. Now, I should say, please do try and post your questions as early as possible, and we'll collect them all and pose them to our panelists at the end. So now on to our speakers. Now later on, you'll be hearing from my colleague at the University of Glasgow, Dr. Tanya Wilson. Tanya is a senior lecturer in economics at the Adam Smith Business School, a research fellow at the Institute of Labour Economics. Tanya is an applied economist, and alongside having just been awarded a prestigious Leverhulme Fellowship, Tanya has recently taken up office as the president of the Scottish Economic Society. First up, we'll hear from colleagues from the IFS. So David Phillips is an associate director at the IFS and leads on their devolved and local government finance work. David was one of the authors of a recent independent review of the fiscal frameworks for Scotland and is a well-regarded expert on Scotland's public finances. Stuart Adam is a senior economist at IFS with a particular focus on the design of the tax and benefit system, and he's written about many aspects of tax and benefit policy over the years. And he was an author and editor of the famous Murley's review of the UK tax system. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to hand over to our colleagues at IFS, first of all, for their reflections, and then we'll hear from Tanya, and then we'll open up for the Q&A. So David and Stuart, thank you so much for joining us. Really looking forward to hearing your remarks. So over to you.
Thank you, Graeme, and hello, everyone. So I'm going to kick off the IFS part of today's presentations with a look at the funding, spending and public service performance context of the Scottish Parliament elections. before then looking at what the parties say about public services and spending. I'll then hand it to my colleague Stuart to look at tax and benefit policy before it comes back to me to discuss the overall similarities and differences in the parties' plans, including what they'd mean for the Scottish Government's budget. Okay, so let's begin. Well, first up, a quick reminder of what is and isn't devolved to the Scottish Parliament and Government. The politicians elected on May 7th will set policy and spending for health, education, local government, and a range of other areas, including parts of the benefit system. But a range of important areas are reserved to Westminster. Most benefits, but also immigration, defence, energy, and competition and labour market policy. Now, to pay for these things that it's responsible for, the Scottish Government had £7 billion in funding, overwhelmingly from the UK government, but also partly from borrowing for capital investment in the financial year just ended. That's to pay for things like new roads, hospitals, and equipment. And it then had around £52 billion for day-to-day spending on running and providing services and the benefits that it's responsible for. Now, just over half of that comes in the form of a block grant from the UK government, with devolved taxes and other sources making up the remaining half. And you can see here the devolved portion of income tax makes up by far the largest share of that devolved element. But it's still the case because of the way the Scottish fiscal framework works. It's UK government decisions that are the main determinants of Scottish government funding, but with some levers to vary taxes too at the Scottish level. So how has funding been changing over time? Well, in recent years, it's actually been increasing quite significantly, an average of 2.3% per year above economy-wide inflation between 2019-20 and 2025-26. And that's about 1.7% per year per person after accounting for population growth. According to the official methodology, the Scottish Government received around 26% more per person than was spent by the UK Government on comparable services in England in 2024-2025, the last year for which outturned data is available. Although it is worth noting that funding advantage has now started coming down over time. It was 32% in 2019, 26% by 24, and probably around 22% by 2028. That's not because of an active decision by the UK government to reduce Scotland's funding. It's part of the design of the Barnett formula. And looking ahead, as well as that convergence in funding, that shrinking funding advantage, funding growth is also set to slow significantly as the UK government tries to reduce the national budget deficit. Scottish policies, including a not particularly sustainable habit of using one-off funding pots to pay for recurrent spending like pay increases, are also adding to the pressure in the years ahead. So this chart shows, again, the above inflation or below inflation changes in Scottish funding over the next few years. And you can see here that 2026-27, the year we've just entered, it's broadly in line with the trend for the last few years. But actually, it's then much tougher, and particularly 2027-2028, the first budget for the next Scottish government, that is going to be particularly tough, especially when you kind of account for the fact that, benefit spending is increasing, the amount for public services falling by 1.3% in real terms in 27-28. A really tough outlook. And that means protecting, let alone increasing funding to the NHS, would mean even deeper cuts to other services. And in fact, the outgoing government has penciled in cuts for things like council, police and justice, and a range of other spending areas in the multi-year spending review published in January. So already we can see those tough trade-offs. Now, added to that difficult financial outlook are public services that are underperforming, both on an historical basis and sometimes compared to England. So NHS rates have finally started to fall, but are much longer than pre-pandemic. There's been a seemingly long-term decline in schooling standards as well, and 29% of pupils are absent at least 1 in 10 days in Scotland compared to 20% in England. So a school attendance issue there as well. Now, difficulties in the NHS are in spite of substantial increases in staffing. Total staff numbers are up about 14% since before the pandemic, and that's driven by medical staff, not administrators. But the number of admissions and outpatient appointments delivered is still below pre-pandemic levels, and that suggests a decline in hospital productivity, the reasons for which are not fully clear. Now, the same decline in productivity is evident in England and Wales as well, but there, even bigger increases in NHS staffing have allowed activity to rise above pre-pandemic levels. Now, turning to schools, differences in education systems make direct comparisons difficult, but the internationally comparable PISA tests that a subset of 15-year-old pupils take suggest a decline in performance over the last 10 to 15 years in Scotland, relative to not only other high-income countries, but also compared to England. So I'm not saying any of this just to sort of bash the Scottish government, but to highlight the range of challenges the next government will have to try to address in a tricky funding environment. So what do the parties say they'll do? Well, first on the biggie, health. A few parties have actually provided some detail on their spending plans. So for day-to-day spending, the SNP say they'd pass on all funding received via the Barnett formula as a result of increases in health spending in England to the health and social care portfolio of the Scottish government. Now, that'd be a slightly smaller proportional increase than in England for that whole portfolio, which is broader than what's covered by the NHS in England. The SNP also had a 10-year investment spending pledge, but that's almost certainly a cut in real terms compared to their own spending review plans for the next 3 years. Labour, on the other hand, say they'd spend at least £25 billion a year by 2030, although given the Scottish spending review plans laid out in January to 28-29, that would basically mean no further increase over the rest of the Parliament, and more like £26 billion a year would be needed to maintain growth rates. The Conservatives say they would increase funding by above inflation each year, which is actually not a very stretching target and would nowhere near be enough to maintain, let alone improve NHS services ordinarily. But they also highlight increases above current spending review plans, which would be much more generous. And trying to make sense of this is a little bit tricky, but perhaps this reflects an emphasis of increasing frontline spending while pledging cuts in the back office and other support costs. A question mark over that, as we'll discuss at the end. And when it comes to health policy, there's some similarities on priorities. Of course, everyone's saying they want it to be better, although the challenge in delivering that shouldn't be underestimated. All parties also had to focus on prevention, primary care, mental health support, and shifting money this way while continuing to bring hospital waiting lists down would require some big improvements in productivity or some big spending. Now, there are differences in scale about what the parties propose, but specific details are a bit thin on the ground. The Greens, though, do say they want to expand and improve almost every aspect of the health and social care system. Reform have the least detail, but propose what they say would be an ambitious review post-election. Turning to schools, several parties make pledges on school staffing. Again, the Greens propose the biggest increase in resources with smaller class sizes and lighter teacher workloads. The SNP say they would at least maintain pupil-teacher ratios, but also they say they'd guarantee all trainee teachers a job. And when pupil numbers are falling, that probably actually means they're also looking to reduce class sizes. Labour focus on 2,000 so-called recovery teachers to help those struggling most with literacy and numeracy over the first 3 years of the Parliament. And like the Conservatives, they want more classroom assistants. But beyond this sort of extra resources, the party's visions for Scottish schooling differ quite significantly. Reform, the Conservatives, and to some extent Labour actually, propose more testing, benchmarking, and new behaviour standards, a slightly more sort of traditional approach, if you like. In contrast, the Greens and Lib Dems emphasise play-based learning for young children and continuous teacher-led assessment rather than exams. And of course, that latter proposal would need to be thought about carefully given issues around potential inconsistencies and the impact of AI. Childcare is another biggie. All parties, bar reform, highlight expansions of childcare provision. The Greens go down the universal route with the option for the parents of the youngest children to take a cash payment instead if they don't feel they need the childcare. The Conservatives propose an expansion of provision for working parents, like the scheme they introduced in England. The SNP proposed something covering not just preschool children, but also primary school children, or where they'd means test that support. And Labour's proposals are more modest, but also less costly than the others, topping up the UK government's tax-free childcare programme. Now, the effects of all of these will differ between families who do and don't already use formal childcare. For those who do, it's mainly a cost of living benefit, with the government picking up a tab for the bill that they're currently paying themselves. For those who don't actually use it, it's not saving them money, but they may start to use it instead, with potential beneficial impacts on child development or labour supply, although there can be trade-offs between these objectives in terms of the design of childcare schemes. So, for example, restricting eligibility to expanded support to in-work families, as the Conservatives propose, is likely to increase the financial incentive to work, but mean that children who may benefit most in terms of the development, often in out-of-work families, lose out. Means testing, on the other hand, like the SNP proposed, can target those children from deprived families and save money compared to universal provision, but it can weaken the work incentives that families face, as working more can reduce the amount of free support that a family is entitled to. Now, turning to infrastructure and housing, all parties propose investment in rail services. Roads and cars, though, are more of a dividing line. Reform of the Conservatives propose major road building. The SNP and Labour highlight some priority schemes, and like the parties of the right highlight potholes as an issue they want to address. In contrast, the Greame signal opposition to major new road schemes. And views on active travel and net zero are the mirror image of this, basically. Green's expanding, Reform of the Conservatives cutting back to help fund some of their road investments. Housing, of course, is a key issue. The Greens, SNP and Labour pledge increases in social and affordable housing construction of different scales. Interestingly, in the SNP's case, above and beyond their own government's January 2026 plans. The Conservatives and Labour suggest planning reforms to ease development, while, if anything, Reform propose a tighter planning system. Rent controls are the big dividing line on housing. Reform and the Conservatives oppose those, say they would scrap the legislation. The Greens would double down with tighter rent caps, helping some tenants, but alongside tax changes Stuart will discuss, risky indeed. And if there was a rabbit in this election, of course, it was pulled out of John Swinney's hat as another cost of living proposal. Price caps set by ministers for the cheapest versions of 20 to 50 essential foods in big supermarkets. Now, of course, food prices have risen a lot in recent years, and that's clearly of particular concern for low-income families who spend a larger share of their budgets on food. But evidence suggests these increases in food prices have been driven by international price rises and increases in costs rather than increases in profit margins. There doesn't appear to be a competition case for price caps. And of course, while lower food prices would be clearly welcomed, legal caps below market prices can have adverse consequences in terms of product availability and potentially quality, where that can be affected. Now, the stringency and design of this would matter a lot. Research elsewhere suggests that caps slightly below market prices may not lead to shortages if there are rules in place that can, credibly require retailers to ensure sufficient supply of those products. But then, of course, if it's only a small cap, the impact on the overall cost of living is also pretty marginal too. And in Scotland's case, it's far from clear the Scottish Government has the powers to implement price caps, let alone mandate supply. And there are potentially other ways you can support households more directly with the cost of living. Sticking with cost of living measures, the Greens and SNP pledged several other policies, with subsidised or free buses being the biggest. Again, Labour is more cautious on committing to new big spending pledges here, as it is somewhat more generally across the board. And with that, I'll hand over to Stuart to talk about taxes and benefits.
Thanks, David. Good afternoon, everybody. So this chart shows which taxes are devolved to Scotland and how much of the revenue comes from each. You can see the picture is dominated by income tax, which raises about 3/4 of the revenue the Scottish Government gets in taxes, about £20 billion. Almost all of the rest comes from property taxes. So for the next 10 minutes or so, I'm essentially going to go round these pie charts, looking at each of the taxes, biggest to smallest, and talking about what the Scottish Government has done since the last election in 2021 and what the different parties' manifestos propose. And then I'll say a bit about benefit policies. There's a lot to cover, so this won't be comprehensive, but we can get into other details during the Q&A if people want. So starting with the big one, income tax. Income tax, since it started to diverge from that in the rest of the UK, has been higher, more progressive and more complicated than it is in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And changes introduced since 2021 have basically gone further in that direction, increasing income tax at the top to raise more revenue and making it more complicated in the process, adding even more bands to an already complicated system. What do the different parties propose? Well, the Greame Party proposed to introduce higher tax rates for rental income. So without changing the main rates of income tax, that would still go in the direction, again, of raising revenue, making it more progressive, but also making it more complicated. The SNP, who've been in power, seem to feel they've gone far enough in that direction. They're saying they wouldn't increase headline rate, so they don't actually rule out raising revenue by reducing thresholds. They say they wouldn't add any new bands and ideally would aim to simplify the system. Labour say more specifically there wouldn't be any increase in income tax, and actually they would aim to cut it if fiscal conditions allowed. And the Liberal Democrats say the same thing, although the two parties have slightly different priorities for the way that they would cut income tax if finances did allow. The Conservatives and Reform both propose chunky cuts in income tax. Rather than go through all of the wording on the screen, I think the easiest way to see this will be on a chart. So this chart shows the marginal income tax rate schedule as it's currently due to be by the end of the next Parliament. And you can see the rather strange, complicated rate schedule, all of the different rates that apply as a result of both UK and Scottish Government policies. The Conservatives want to simplify this by essentially getting rid of the 19%, 20% and 21% separate rates, having a single wide basic rate band, increasing the point at which income tax starts to be paid, and also increasing the point at which higher rate tax starts to be paid. Reform describe their policy in a somewhat different way, as essentially aligning thresholds with UK income tax thresholds, and then initially just reducing all rates by 1 percentage point, so even 1 percentage point below rates elsewhere in the UK. Actually, that has a lot in common with the Conservative plans. In both cases, this a single wide basic rate band, higher rate threshold aligned with where it is in the rest of the UK. But Reform also want to cut and simplify tax rates above the higher rate threshold, which the Conservatives don't mention, while the Conservatives prioritise increasing the point at which tax starts to be paid. This is what Reform say they would do initially. They then say they would like by the end of the Parliament to go further with an objective of setting rates 3 percentage points below rates in the rest of the UK by the end of the next Parliament. So the Conservatives say that their income tax cuts would cost about £3 billion a year, so that's pretty big in the context of the Scottish government. We think it might actually be a bit less than that. Reform initial proposal will be about 2.3 billion a year. If they went to 3 percentage points below, that will be more like 4 billion a year, so more rather than less big giveaway than the Conservatives. The Reforms claim that these tax cuts would pay for themselves is essentially for the birds. It is possible, they're not certain, that cutting the top rate of tax would pay for itself. The whole package would certainly stimulate economic activity and growth, but not by anywhere near enough to pay for itself in full. So who would benefit from these tax cuts? So this chart compares the distributional effects across different household groups of the Conservatives' plans and the Reform's ultimate objective. And you can see much bigger income tax cuts from the Reform proposals for high-income households, whereas the Conservatives' giveaway is actually slightly bigger than the Reform's giveaway for low-income households, which you can see more clearly if I show you the same chart as a percentage of household income rather than in cash terms. You can see those bigger giveaways from the Conservatives' proposals at the bottom, driven by increasing the amount you can earn before you start to pay income tax. But both parties' giveaways will be predominantly benefiting higher income households. The flip side of that is that these will both be quite well targeted at strengthening work incentives. So turning to the next biggest tax, council tax. Average council tax rates have actually risen by less than inflation since 2021. But aside from small average real terms cuts, council tax is badly in need of fundamental reform, not least because council tax bans are still based on the relative values that properties had in 1991. That's 35 years ago now, and counting. It really needs bringing up to date and reforming in other ways. Sadly, we haven't seen any of that from the Scottish Government. We've just seen a continuation of the process of consultation, engagement, commissioning research, including from us, but not actually doing anything fundamental. And they say that essentially consensus is needed, and they would continue trying to build consensus. Nevertheless, when Rachel Reeves in the last UK budget announced the introduction of a high-value council tax surcharge, a so-called mansion tax, the Scottish Government followed suit within weeks, apparently without any such need for consultation and consensus building. In terms of where the party's plans are going forward, both the SNP and Labour continue to talk about the need for fundamental reform while just saying that they would carry on trying to build a consensus for that, not just a majority to pass legislation. The Liberal Democrats also talk about restarting cross-party talks, but at least with a specific proposal they have in mind of moving towards land value tax rather than a property value tax. The Greens would go in a different direction. Rather encouragingly, they want to update council tax, or rather replace it with an updated tax that is more proportional to value, increasing bills at the top and reducing them lower down. The Greens assume that councils would set higher average bills than they do now to help pay for some of the extra responsibilities that they would have as a result of the extra spending that David was talking about. Reform, they mention much about fundamental reform, but they do say that they would like to cancel the council tax, the high-value council tax surcharge that is due to come in. The Conservative manifesto doesn't actually mention council tax at all, but they did say only a couple of months ago that they would oppose any revaluation of council tax, which is somewhat disappointing. On business rates, the main changes we've seen since 2021 have been to reduce business rates for low-value properties and especially to reduce it for retail, hospitality and leisure, not yet on a permanent basis, as has been announced for England, but at least for the next 3 years. Again, the SNP and Labour both say that reform is needed. They both say that they want to improve the tax and achieve various things with it, but don't say much in terms of specifics of how they would actually reform business rates. The Conservatives, in contrast, have quite a specific package of business rate reforms that they propose, which I won't go into all the detail of now. I think most of those reforms actually look pretty sensible, although some of them very much do not. Reform want to replace business rates altogether, along with land building transaction tax, with an annual property tax. I'll come back to that in a moment. But oddly, at the same time, they say that they would reverse the recent business rates revaluation and end revaluations altogether. That seems altogether retrograde step. It would mean leaving business rates stuck in the past like council tax is, and also means bills essentially rising for those businesses that are struggling most. The Liberal Democrats, as with council tax, say they want to work towards a system with an element of land value taxation. The Greens take a rather different approach from the other parties. They talk about wanting to tax vacant and derelict land, which seems a very sensible thing to do. On top of that, they propose a big new range of surcharges and reliefs, everything from relief for workplace nurseries to higher business rates on big supermarkets selling alcohol and tobacco. So essentially, they want to use business rates to encourage some behaviour and discourage others. They're quite why it's worse for big supermarkets to sell alcohol and tobacco than for smaller retailers to sell them is not entirely clear. But either way, it would lead to a more complicated business rate system to try and achieve particular social objectives that the Green Party has. The last of the big taxes, land and buildings transaction tax, is a particularly dreadful tax, discouraging mutually beneficial transactions, stop people from buying and moving to the houses that they really want to live in. In that context, it's rather a shame that the main thing the Scottish Government has done since 2021 is to make this damaging tax even bigger and even worse designed. Bigger both by continuing the long freeze in LBTT thresholds, making more and more transactions fall into the tax and into higher tax bands, but also by doubling the surcharge that people buying a property as a second home or to rent out have to pay. The SNP don't mention doing anything more on LBTT. The Greens want to go even further in the same direction with more increases for high value properties and for second and rental properties and other things besides. It's worth noting that this increase on for LBTT on rental properties coming up on top of an income tax increase on landlords' rental income and tighter rent caps is all squeezing landlords very hard, making renting out property even less attractive. That combination of things may well mean more properties are made available for people to buy for owner occupation, but is likely to lead to a shortage of rental properties, make it even more of a struggle for those people who are looking to rent to find somewhere. The Conservatives want to go in the opposite direction, reversing the increases that we've seen for second and rental properties, which seems like a good thing. And actually, they want to abolish LBTT for main homes completely, although only if the Westminster government does that, as the Conservatives in Westminster propose that they should. Reform also want to get rid of business rates, but in this case, replacing it with an annual property tax, as I mentioned, alongside business rates. That seemed like a great idea. An annual property tax is a much better way to tax property than a transaction tax. Labour and the Lib Dems both propose more modest reductions in LBTT, reductions for particular groups. This is a terrible tax, so frankly, almost any reduction is going to be a good thing, although simple across-the-board reductions would probably have been better. So far I've talked about taxes. Turning to the benefits side, this pie chart again shows which benefits are devolved and how much of benefit spending goes on each. Quite a lot of this is new, from the devolution and then means testing of winter heating payments for pensioners to mitigation of the UK government's benefit tax. But two key developments stand out. One is the introduction of devolved disability benefits to replace the UK ones. The Scottish benefits have been set at the same rates as the UK benefits, but the process for application has been made easier, which initially resulted in a big spike in claims for these benefits. Although interestingly, what we've seen more recently is that the success rate of applications has fallen quite dramatically for reasons that we don't fully understand. And so the rate at which numbers of people on disability benefits is not it doesn't look like diverging further from where it is in the rest of the UK. The second development worth highlighting is Scottish child payment. So the yellow segment on this pie chart is a fairly small part of the total, but bear in mind this is one thing that is basically in addition to the existing benefit system, not just replacing what the UK government was doing. And Scottish child payment has been made much bigger. The rate has more than doubled in real terms to £28 per child per week, and is now paid for children up to age 15, not just up to age 5. In terms of the party's plans, the SNP and Labour essentially don't mention benefits at all. The Greens want to go further in the direction that the Scottish government's already gone in, with another big increase in Scottish child payments and other benefit increases. And they also want a double lock for benefits for children, a bit like the triple lock for the state pension that has become familiar. And as with the triple lock for pensions, that is basically a terrible idea as a way to make policy for the long term. We're happy to come back to that in the Q&A if people are interested. Reform and the Lib Dems both want to get rid of the cliff edge in carer benefits, which means that earning £1 more can mean losing these benefits completely. That seems like a sensible thing to do. The Lib Dems also talk about increasing the rates of those benefits a bit. But the big story on benefit reform is the Conservatives, who want a really big tightening of the conditions for getting adult disability benefits on grounds of mental ill health in such a way that actually most recipients wouldn't now be eligible. Conservatives think that would save almost £2 billion, though history suggests it might not actually succeed in saving that much, not least because people change behaviour to ensure that they qualify. So, to sum up, the Scottish Government's record over the last 5 years has been building on what it's done before to make both higher taxes and higher benefits, and making both more progressive. To see what this looks like across the distribution, it's helpful to separate out households with children and households without children. The benefit increases for low-income households almost entirely go to those with children through Scottish child payment, whereas those with high incomes pay more as a result of higher income tax, whether or not they've got children. While they made tax and benefit system bigger and more progressive, the Scottish Government really hasn't improved the structure of the system. We've seen even more income tax rates. They've ducked council tax reform. They've made LBTT even worse, and so on. The party's plans can be summarised relatively straightforwardly. The SNP and Labour don't actually have many specific proposals beyond saying they don't want to raise income tax. Labour says it would like to cut income tax if funding allows, as do the Lib Dems. Reform and the Conservatives both want big tax cuts, and in the Tories' case, big benefit cuts as well. And that actually goes beyond the tax cuts I've already talked about. The Conservatives have also said they want to eliminate the first £500 a year of income tax on pension income, and they want annual tax rebates for households effectively funded by running down the Scottish Government's reserves, which doesn't look like very prudent fiscal management. Reform Party also says it wants to cap the effective marginal tax rates that people face at 50%. Insofar as devolved powers allow. Now, it's not clear whether they really have thought that through and mean it. If they really mean that, that would mean more very big tax cuts and big benefit increases. Whether it's that or whether it was just a more throwaway remark is not entirely clear. The Greens essentially want to use tax policy to change behaviour and change society in some ways that look sensible, some that look harder to justify. There are some truly dreadful policies in there. But the general principle of a more activist government trying to use the tax system in that way is a perfectly legitimate thing to do. The inevitable downside is that it will make the tax system much more complicated than it is already in the ways I've talked about, also in a whole bunch of other ways, including introducing lots of new taxes from a carbon land tax to a stadium levy. So trying to achieve lots of things and making the tax system very complicated in order to do so. At that point, I will stop and hand back to David to talk about the big picture.
Thank you, Stuart. So what do you make of the party's proposals as a whole? Well, there are some common themes that are clearly there. All pledge to improve the NHS and the nation's health with some useful ideas, but the challenges really are huge there. Education is another area opposition parties, at least, argue change is needed, but the visions on that change differ radically between parties. Cost of living is a clear issue for voters, and so for parties too. It's a key motivator both for proposed tax cuts and new free or subsidised welfare entitlements and new regulations. And there are a raft of pledges for investment spending on housing and rail across the board, with big differences on road, cycling and net zero, and how to pay for all of this, with the constraints on borrowing and capital budgets also is a question often left unanswered. But there are also some big differences in the visions between the parties. As Stuart was saying, Reform UK and the Conservatives pledged tax cuts, much larger in scale compared to their Welsh cousins. And while there are clearly many differences in their policies and approaches, they're also both traditionalists in education. They want more spending on roads and less on climate and cycling schemes. The Greens and SNP, on the other hand, pledge a bigger, more activist state, big expansions of free or subsidised childcare. The SNP add £2 buses and food price caps. The Greens add free buses, free dentistry, smaller class sizes, huge increases in GP numbers, up 50%, and so on. Labour and the Lib Dems are somewhere in the middle, with more of a focus on existing services and an aim but no commitments to some tax cuts. The expansions of childcare are modest by comparison with the other parties, although interestingly, Labour seem closer to the parties of the right on schools, while the Lib Dems look much more similar to the Greens. How do these plans compare to fiscal reality? Well, in truth, none of the parties has fully confronted the fiscal reality facing the next government, including having to make an overall cut to spending in its very first budget. But the money they need to find to deliver their plans does differ in scale. As Stuart said, reforms claim that growth would pay for its tax cut does not stand up to scrutiny. Fiscal framework rules mean that cuts to net zero spending can't be relied upon for tax cuts. So implicitly, reform is relying on billions of largely unspecified and likely undeliverable efficiencies on top of the significant ones already being assumed in spending review plans. The Conservatives' manifesto is a much more detailed affair, and they do identify some specific benefit cuts to pay for a fair chunk of their tax cuts, although perhaps not quite as much money as they hope from. But the near $4 billion in efficiencies that even on their figures they say they need to find on top of existing plans are, in our view, not credible, or at least not credible in terms of just efficiencies. Cuts of that scale are possible, but would hit the front line, not just the back office. The Greens set up the biggest spending pledges and recognise this would require higher taxes, but the taxes would need to rise by even more than they say they would unless they're willing to make substantial cuts to some other areas of spending. And as Stuart was saying, the tax plans they've set out would massively further complicate the tax system. The SNP spending giveaways are smaller, but like the parties of the right, they say that growth and efficiencies would rise to the rescue to find their $1.4 billion, again, on top of what they've already said they need to find in the spending review. Finally, Labour and the Lib Dems focus on existing services and smaller giveaways, creating the smallest hole to fill from efficiencies. But as I said at the start, though, funding the NHS sufficiently already implies some chunky cuts to other spending without any new tax cuts or spending increases. So voters face big choices. Parties do have quite radically different visions for Scotland. The boldest proposals come with the biggest price tags and the biggest trade-offs elsewhere in an already very difficult budgetary outlook. There are no free lunches here. Scotland can have lower taxes if it has a state that does less, or a state that does more if it's willing to pay more for that. More modest proposals would create less of an additional fiscal challenge, but do they deliver the changes that the people of Scotland want? Only the electorate can decide that. And with that, I'll hand over to Tanya to talk about some of the economic issues that we haven't covered yet in the presentations.
So thank you very much, David. So let me start with a quick overview of where the Scottish economy currently stands. The labour market at first glance looks strong relative to the UK average. The unemployment rate is around 4.1%, which is lower than for the UK overall. So in that sense, Scotland is performing well with a relatively strong demand for labour. Another point to highlight is the role of the public sector in Scotland, which accounts for almost 3 in 10 employees. This is a larger public sector footprint relative to the UK as a whole and has a couple of implications. On the one hand, it can provide stability as public sector employment tends to be less volatile over the economic cycle. But on the other hand, it also means that the overall performance of the economy is more closely tied to public spending decisions. So it's an important structural feature to keep in mind when thinking about growth, employment, and policy choices. However, the more important issue is inactivity. 23% of the working age population in Scotland is not in the labour force, which is higher than for the UK overall. On distributional measures, Scotland performs relatively well. The gender pay gap is approximately half of that in the UK, and youth unemployment is also lower, suggesting relatively better labour market opportunities for young people. So overall, the picture here is somewhat mixed. There are some strong headline indicators, but also some underlying concerns. And let me now turn to growth. Scotland's recent performance in terms of GDP growth is in line with that of the UK. The economy in Scotland is estimated to have grown by around 1.4% in 2025, which is slightly ahead of UK growth of around 1.3%. But looking ahead across all the major forecasters, the key message is that growth will be subdued going forward. The Office for Budget Responsibility forecasts UK growth of around 1.1% in 2026. The Scottish Fiscal Commission is slightly more optimistic for Scotland than that and puts it at around 1.3%. However, it should be noticed that both of these forecasts were produced before the tensions erupted recently in Iran. The Fraser-of-Allender Institute, which updated its forecast more frequently, puts growth closer to 0.9% in Scotland. So depending which forecast you take, Scotland is either broadly in line with the UK or slightly weaker. But the important point here to note is that growth is low across the board, regardless of which forecast you look at. And with the continuing geopolitical developments and energy price increases, the risks to growth are likely to be on the downside. On trade, Scotland has seen stronger short-term performance than the UK, with export growth of 2.9% over the past year, compared to a decline at the UK level. With that context in mind, I'm just going to summarise where Scotland's key strengths and challenges lie. On the one hand, there are some clear strengths. Unemployment is lower in Scotland than in the UK, which suggests that conditional on being in the labour force, people are relatively likely to find work. Scotland also performs relatively well on equality measures, particularly the gender pay gap. In addition, recent export growth has been stronger than the UK, and in the most recent data, Scotland's growth performance is broadly in line with the UK. But the more important story is on the challenges side, with economic inactivity a significant issue. Almost 1 in 4 of the working age population in Scotland is not participating in the labour market. And this is often linked to long-term sickness, disability, or demographic factors, and it acts as a constraint on growth. The employment rate is also slightly lower than the UK, which is consistent with that inactivity story. On trade, there are deeper issues beyond the short-term figures that I presented. Around 60% of Scottish exports go to the rest of the UK, which indicates a high degree of concentration, and indeed exports to the EU remain below that of the pre-2018 levels. And in real terms, trade growth has been relatively weak, so the recent improvement does not necessarily reflect a strong long-term trend. And finally, as I was saying, the growth outlook has been downgraded in more recent forecasts. So to summarise, the overall picture in Scotland is one of balance. The economy performs well relative to the UK across several dimensions, but it is constrained. And that's important because it shapes how we think about policy responses. And with that in mind, let me turn to how the different political parties are responding to these challenges. And what's striking is that the challenges facing the Scottish economy, as David was saying, are broadly agreed across the parties, but the solutions differ quite fundamentally. So first of all, for the Conservatives, and what I've done here is to present a word cloud that is generated from the content of the manifesto. So the size of the word indicates how frequently it appears. And this can be a really useful way for highlighting key themes. For the Conservatives manifesto, what stands out immediately is the prominence of terms like economy and jobs. The manifesto is centred on economic growth, with a strong emphasis on getting the economy working more effectively. In terms of jobs and growth, the approach is market-led, with a focus on creating the conditions for private sector expansion, particularly through support for business investment, skills, and employment incentives. Jobs are framed as the main route to improving living standards. On the role of the state, the position of the Conservatives is that the state should be leaner and more efficient, with less bureaucracy and a greater focus on enabling rather than directing economic activity. On energy, the manifesto emphasises oil and gas alongside energy security, with the sector framed as a key driver of jobs, investment, and competitiveness. On the constitutional question, the position is firmly pro-union, with an implicit focus on the UK internal market as a central trading and economic framework. The most prominent words in the Scottish Greens manifesto are climate, action, and justice, which signals their central focus of climate action as the organising principle for the economy. In terms of jobs and growth, the emphasis is on the green transition, with investment directed towards renewable energy, public services, and low-carbon industries. The state here is positioned as a central actor in restructuring the economy through public investment, regulation, and redistribution. On energy, they have a very clear position, a rapid move away from fossil fuels towards renewables, and a just transition, with strong links to fairness and inequality. And regarding the constitutional question, their position is pro-independence, with a strong orientation towards closer integration with Europe. Labour's approach places growth at the centre and emphasises delivering it through industrial strategy, skills, and partnership with business. There is a strong focus on productivity through technology adoption and investment. On energy, they balance net zero ambitions with economic considerations rather than taking a strong pro or anti-fossil fuel stance. They support renewables, but also nuclear and a managed transition from oil and gas. Constitutionally, the Labour's position is pro-union, with the focus on improving outcomes within the existing UK framework. The Liberal Democrats' manifesto is centred on fairness as the organising principle, particularly in how the economy delivers outcomes for individuals and communities. Growth is framed alongside opportunity, skill, and access to services. The state is seen as essential in delivering effective public services, but with a strong emphasis on efficiency and value for money rather than expansion. On energy, the focus is on net zero and clean energy, but balancing environmental goals with economic stability. And finally, on the constitutional question, the position is pro-union but reform-orientated, with a clear emphasis on closer ties with Europe, particularly through a customs union. The dominant terms in Reform's UK manifesto highlight tax, work, economy, and jobs. And this manifesto centres on a work-led, low-tax economic model with a strong emphasis on incentives. Growth is expected to come from lower taxes, reduced regulation, and stronger incentives to work and invest. The state is framed as being too large and inefficient, and they have a clear objective to reduce spending. On energy, there is a strong emphasis on fossil fuels and domestic energy production, with net zero policies often framed as a constraint on growth. On the constitutional question, the position of Reform UK is firmly pro-union, with a strong emphasis on the UK as the primary economic unit. In contrast, the SNP forward a state-led model that combines economic growth with redistribution and state coordination. The SNP approach focuses on inclusive growth, combining investment, skills, and support for businesses, with a focus on reducing poverty and inequality and improving job quality through the Fair Work agenda. Energy is central, particularly renewables and a just transition. And independence is framed as necessary to deliver stronger economic performance. So the SNP views the state as playing an active role in delivering services, redistributing income, and supporting households. And they are firmly pro-independent, with independence framed as the key to unlocking better economic performance. So to summarise, what really differentiates the parties is not individual policies, but the underlying economic model. And here in this diagram, we map those models along two key dimensions: the role of the state and whether the focus is primarily on growth or on distribution and sustainability. On the right-hand side, we have more state-led approaches, particularly the Greens and the SNP, while on the left-hand side are more market-led models, especially Reform and the Conservatives. The vertical dimension captures priorities: growth first at the top versus distribution, fairness, and sustainability at the bottom. And what you see is a clear spread from a low-tax, small-state growth model on one end to a more interventionist redistribution or climate-focused model on the other, with Labour and the Liberal Democrats occupying more centrist positions. And important, the constitutional question sits on top of this, shaping the economic framework. So that's my brief summary, and I will hand back over to Graham, I think.
Brilliant. Great. Thank you, Tanya, David and Stuart. So that gives us a really fantastic overview, I think, of some brilliant work on the manifestos and broader context about where this debate sits. So thank you, everyone there, for that great contribution, and also all the work that's gone into it. I know you present very quickly and very eloquently in there, but I know a lot of thought has really gone into that, so that's very much appreciated. So we've got about half an hour for questions, As I said at the start, please feel free to put your questions into the comments on YouTube or into Slido. The advantage of Slido is you can vote for questions, so we can see which ones are the most popular, and we can get around them as early as we can. And just for our panelists, what I'll do is I'll maybe throw a question to one of you, but if you feel as though you'd like to nominate somebody else, if it's a real hot potato question and you want to pass it over, then please feel free to do that. Maybe if I could come with quite a pointed one, actually, and maybe David, you might be good to go in this, and also Stuart as well, from your work on the manifestos you did 2 years ago for the UK election as well, where there's quite a blunt question about, are parties being honest with voters about the scale of the fiscal challenge, or are we just kicking the can down for our kids, so future generations, to deal with? So maybe I'll come to you, David, first, and then Tanya, might be quite interested to get your view from an economic perspective as well. But David, do you want to go first on that?
Yeah, great. Well, look, I actually have a little bit of sympathy with political parties here. It's a tradition, if you like, that parties will put what they kind of say is their best foot forward. They'll perhaps kind of give you the kind of half of the story, the things they want to do more or tax less, and leave it a little bit unspoken, if you like, kind of the other side of the ledger. And also, for a long time, and I'm going to give a big step back here, but for a long time, parties were able to, if you like, deliver more in terms of the welfare state, not through putting up taxes, but through cutting back defense spending. That's kind of the big growth of the welfare state during the second half of the 20th century. We're now in a world where that's not the case. We're in a world where we're having to have, spend more both on, butter, but also the guns, more on welfare state and more on defense at the same time. So that's a challenge, not just in these elections, but a challenge across the Western world. And of course, when the public are angry, and they're angry about, cost of living, the state of services, are they in the mood for, some sort of hard, cold fiscal reality? Perhaps not. So look, I'm prefacing by saying I have some sympathy for parties here in the position they're in, but I agree. They aren't being upfront about the kind of state of the challenges ahead. As I said, the very first budget the Scottish Government will be one where it's having to cut back spending before you think about adding on new entitlements for certain services or making some tax cuts. Now, it's perfectly feasible to have a Scotland with a smaller tax burden or a bigger state doing more, but that is going to require tough things elsewhere. So, yeah, they're not being entirely honest. I think that voters need to perhaps be willing for some radical honesty on that as well. And what I think I would say is that if we could get into a slightly better equilibrium on politics, that would be good, right? Because one of the challenges is if you don't kind of prepare voters in advance for tough decisions that could be following after an election, that can lead to a sort of cycle of sort of repeated sort of disappointment, over-promising and under-delivering, leading to angry voters, leading to voters that aren't then open when people kind of say that, tough choices are needed and they're being honest there. So yeah, I think, this is not a Scotland unique thing, but the scale of the problems in Scotland on the public finances are pretty severe. And therefore, yes, parties haven't done it. But that's why we at the IFS, Fraser Valley Institute and others are here to kind of, say it as it really is.
Great. Well, maybe Tanya, do you want to maybe come in as well? Because I guess you've looked at it particularly from an economic perspective. So I guess some of the big structural economic challenges, which are not unique to Scotland as well. They're challenged across the board. I mean, what's your assessment about how well the parties have engaged with these and how upfront they've been?
Yeah, and I don't want to just repeat David's points, but I mean, I don't think it's about a lack of honesty. It's more about the nature and the purpose of the manifestos themselves, which tend to emphasize the priorities of each of the parties rather than fully specifying trade-offs. And the situation that we're facing is that the fiscal challenge is real. We have low growth and at the same time, rising demand for public services. And with limited fiscal headroom, it becomes very difficult to balance and manage those challenges. And, it's not, the numbers just don't work to simultaneously increase spending whilst at the same time cutting taxes and maintaining sustainability. Like, the math just does not work. But I think the key challenge is not that, this is a situation that is unrecognised. I think all the parties agree that they're facing a tight fiscal situation. But in general, it's about making those trade-offs more explicit. Ultimately, they can't be avoided. And I think this is something as he was saying, as David was saying, the voters can quickly become very, very annoyed when they read something or they hear something from a politician, and then they're saying, but why isn't it being implemented, if they're not aware of all of the other things that are going on at the same time that put pressure on.
Great, thanks, Tanya. And Stuart, you might want to come in on that, but there's a really good question as well, which I want to come to you, because you talked a lot about some of the tax policies and some of the challenges about whether they're effective policies or well designed. It's a really good question there about, okay, the tax and benefit system is becoming more progressive, but it's also becoming more complex. And the question is complexity a risk in its own right, or should that be something that we're relaxed about?
No, I think complexity is a risk and a problem in its own right. Now, simplicity is not the only thing that you should aim for. There are other things. There can be things that justify complicating the system, but it has costs. It's perhaps worth distinguishing two different senses of a tax and benefit system being complicated. There's complicated to operate, and there is complicated to understand. And I think both of those have challenges. I think a more complicated tax system means that it is more expensive, more difficult for the government to administer, more difficult for taxpayers to comply with their obligations. Things are more likely to go wrong. You can get into spiraling problems. Also, unless the complexity is there for a very good reason, it often leads to unintended side effects, and you end up creating incentives to behave in ways that you may not have intended and you may not want. Unless there's some reason, two people randomly facing different marginal tax rates, for example, just means that you're causing more economic damage, more damage to economic growth, for example, than you would be with a smoother, simpler system. Also worth bearing in mind, a lot of the time, the biggest complication associated with policy is change itself, and actually keeping track of and dealing with new features of the system, even if once they're up and running, it's not so bad. I think that's a slightly different issue from complexity to understand. Where I think, it's not so much just about thinking of the practical or economic costs associated with that, but actually that there is something to be said in its own right for people to be able to understand the tax system that they're living with and what they're supposed to do and why. And just as part of a system of democratic accountability, as part of engendering trust in the system, I think having a system that's not too complicated is valuable. So, I don't want to go too far. Complexity is not the be-all and end-all, but it definitely does create problems. It definitely does have costs. And so I'd say, well, only have complexity where there is something really that it's achieving that's worthwhile. And I think we certainly could have a system that is both more effective and simpler than the one Scotland's currently got.
Mm-hmm. Great.
However,
okay. Yeah, Tanya.
Some complexity is inevitable, and it may even be desirable if, for instance, a government is targeting support more precisely and making the system more progressive, which arguably is what the Scottish Government has been trying to achieve. But as Stuart quite rightly says, the risk arises when complexity starts affecting behaviour, when people don't understand entitlements or if take-up falls. So the trade-off is between that precision and simplicity. The key question is whether the additional complexity is improving outcomes enough to justify those administrative and behavioural costs that Stuart mentioned there.
Great. Okay, thanks, Tanya. And I will come back to, there's a question about raising revenue and what options there are to raise revenue, including some of the new taxes coming in. So I'll maybe come back to you, Stuart, on that. But there's a really good question here on from YouTube, which I'd want to get into. Was maybe one for David, really, about the capital spending outlook and the commitments that are being made about capital. And could you expand a wee bit more about that? About why is there so much pressure on the capital budget, and what have the parties said around the capital commitments? And again, do they add up?
Well, yes. So the capital budget is going to be very tight over the next few years. The Scottish Government, in its medium-term financial strategy last year, thought at that stage there was a £2 billion a year hole in the capital budget by, I think, the end of the decade, compared to what it thought would be needed to deliver on its ambitions for capital. Now, it sort of says it's addressed that hole by basically prioritising the schemes it thinks is most important and kind of paring back other schemes, either entirely or kind of pushing back their construction dates. Actually, when you look at the capital budget outlook, things are perhaps not quite as tough as the headline numbers suggest. The headline numbers show the capital budget falling in real terms after this year. But actually, we've also got a big capital scheme starting to wind down over the next few years as well in Scotland, construction of new prisons. And when you kind of account for the kind of winding down of the prison construction program, the amount available for other areas actually is basically constant in real terms over the next few years. So not falling, but still not growing. So I think the kind of key issue is not that this is like a budget that's being massively cut, controlling for that, a prison thing, it's not, but it's just the kind of range of ambitions that people have, kind of like rail, roads, housing, hospitals, schools. At some stage, you do need to think about, what are the real priorities amongst those. Now, there's a couple of things that sometimes kind of get kind of said at this stage. The first is, we can use innovative capital financing models in this case, rather than use our standard capital budget for the UK government or our current borrowing powers. We can use like these private-public partnership type arrangements. Scotland's been thinking about using a model that they've been using in Wales for some time now called the mutual investment model, which is basically where a private sector organisation borrows the money up front. The public sector takes an equity stake in the project, and then it pays the rest of the costs through sort of annual service charges. That approach, which is also being discussed to be used in Wales for potentially, building an M4 bypass and new hospitals, that could be used in Scotland. Does let you do things more quickly, but it's a very expensive way to borrow because private sector borrowing is usually more expensive than public sector borrowing, and you're paying this back, through service charges, and it kind of puts a strain on future budgets. The other thing that's sometimes mentioned is the kind of restrictions on Scottish government borrowing. And it's pointed out that, councils have more borrowing powers than the Scottish government. Councils can set their own borrowing limits based on it being prudential, that they think it's affordable to pay it back. The Scottish government can't do that. If they had more borrowing powers, they could actually just borrow to invest this extra money. Now, in principle, you could give the Scottish government additional borrowing powers. And I think there's a case to give additional borrowing powers for things like volatility, not just on benefits and taxes, which currently they can borrow to address, but borrowing for volatility on public services costs. What if we have industrial pressure and we need to be able to kind of, actually address that using, agency staff or a bigger pay rise? I think there's a scope for borrowing powers there. But additional borrowing powers to borrow billions of pounds a year extra for capital, I think there's kind of two challenges there. One is there's local authority borrowing, there's UK government borrowing, there's no England-only borrowing. And if Scotland and Wales get additional borrowing powers on top of what you already got from councils and what the UK government's doing on their behalf, there's additional borrowing that's they're not there for the English regions, say. Secondly, I think just in general in the UK, we're at a stage where, you might think about decentralizing borrowing powers, but not as additional borrowing powers, but just changing the level of government where they're done, because already we have high debt, high deficit, high debt servicing costs. So look, I've gone on a long time there, I'm sorry, but I guess I'm saying that, yes, it's perhaps not as bad on the capital side as the declining budget shows, because this prison scheme is winding down, but it is going to be tough given the range of ambitions. And I don't think there are any easy solutions to that using innovative finance or just saying, let's devolve more powers, because, the real constraint is the fiscal sustainability of the UK and our ability to pay back borrowing in future years, whether that's through, the Scottish budget paying for service charges, or whether it is in general, just borrowing more as a country.
Great, thanks, David. So maybe come to Stuart as well. Just picking up, I guess, the discussion we had earlier about the complexity of the tax system, and then one of the follow-up questions, where a couple of people have raised this in different forms, is around what other options are available to future Scottish governments to raise decent amounts of revenue over and above what's coming through. So just building on David's point about some of the pressures in there, what could be potential sources of revenue? And I guess the advantage of saying this now after the manifestos are being published is that you've got a free rein to comment on what might be possible in terms of the future. But we've got air departure tax coming down the line. There's a Scottish building safety levy. Are these likely to have material impacts, or do we have to go back to the points about the significance of income tax?
Yeah, so most of the small new taxes that are coming in and the small new taxes that are being proposed aren't going to raise really big amounts of revenue. So you could do them. There may be a good rationale for them. Again, they complicate the system, but the question is whether that's justified, whether as Tanya said, whether the benefits are worth that cost. In terms of raising substantial amounts of revenue, at least given what's been devolved already, if more things got devolved, that opens up more possibilities. But I think you do basically want to be looking at the big taxes, and income tax is overwhelmingly the biggest. It would be perfectly possible to raise more revenue from income tax, but you could also get more revenue from council tax, more revenue from business rates. I would strongly advise against trying to get more revenue from LBTT. I'd also say that there doesn't have to be a conflict between raising more revenue from them and making them better designed, or making them or making them simpler. So, income tax, you could raise more revenue than we do now without having to have 7 different marginal rates. You could even raise more revenue and make it more progressive than it is now. As we've pointed out before, if you just have a nil rate band above the personal allowance and then a 20 or 21% or whatever basic rate, that is more progressive and simpler and can raise you more revenue than having 9 separate 19 and 20 and 21% rates. You just don't need to do that.
And if I can come on there briefly as well. So I think as Stuart said, the big boys here on terms of taxes, it's the property taxes that are devolved and income tax. And, one thing the Scottish government could do is think about not just each tax case by case, what changes could be done for each of them, but think about packages as a whole. So, with council tax, business rates, LBTT all devolved, there's a real chance here to properly reform Scotland's property tax system. And if you had a property tax based on up-to-date values that was less regressive than the current system, a business rates converted to a land value tax that didn't discourage investment so much, and actually the abolition of LBTT, you could have a system that is fairer in the sense that it's based on up-to-date values and doesn't penalise people that move more, and is better for economic growth in that it doesn't discourage those mutual beneficial, trades of properties and people moving to take up jobs or to downsize or so on. And if you have simpler, less economically distortionary taxes, you can actually raise more without damaging the economy. So I think there are options there. They'll like this if I do this. There's an organisation which have looked at the options for raising substantially more revenues if you wanted to, Future Economy Scotland. Now, there's questions about whether or not their proposals were the exact right ones if you wanted to do that, but they basically look at, comprehensive property tax reform and a change to income tax that makes it both, raise more, a bit more progressive and a bit simpler at the same time. And I think that sort of package is where you're looking at if you want to kind of, raise more without causing unnecessary distortions and actually correcting some of the distortions that are already there.
Great. Okay, thanks, David. So we've got about 10 minutes left. So what we're trying to do is get us through as many questions as possible. If we can keep your answers relatively succinct so that we can just get through them all. But I'll maybe come to you first, Tanya, because you made a really interesting point about the backdrop to all of this, global instability and energy prices and trade. How shock-proof are the manifestos to quite a changing economic context?
Yeah, so I think this is, quite visible there. The economic outlook is clearly one of growth, but with downside risks from energy prices, geopolitics, and trade. The manifestos are really built around a baseline scenario rather than addressing resilience to shocks. So some policy, particularly around energy security or public services, indirectly improve resilience, but there's relatively little explicit focus on how these models would perform under stress, I would say.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tanya. Now, I don't want to be accused of not asking this question, given it's about university funding, and this is the Centre for Public Policy webinar. So the question here is wondering, any comments on the party's higher education policies and funding, and are we likely to see tuition fees going forward? David, you've written quite about this in the past, so I'll maybe throw this one to you.
So, yes, 4, perhaps 5 of the parties have kind of made commitments to maintain free tuition. So it's in the SNP, the Greens, the Scottish Conservatives actually as well. I think Labour, can't remember the Lib Dems. There's lots of calls for a full review of Scottish higher education funding and a kind of cross-party consensus on a sustainable funding model, but sort of ruling out at this kind of start one of the options. Now, I'm not saying that there has to be tuition fees in Scotland, but to kind of at the start say one of the models that's potentially forward, that's ruled out by design, that does constrain the options, because if you're not going to have students pay more, you either need to have the government pay more, or you need to have fewer students going to university to kind of square the circle, given the fact that currently there's not enough funding per student. And that's been, I think it's down about 20% in real terms or so over the last 10 years. So, that means, more government money or fewer students. Actually, Reform, one of the things they hint at is fewer students. They talk about fewer students going to universities, kind of cutting back courses that don't deliver, and more students going to technical colleges instead, although making sure that they deliver effectively for students as well is a challenge. We have a history of not particularly effective technical education in the UK more generally, not just in terms of Scotland. So yes, lots of sort of recognition of problems, but no one wants to get close to this sacred cow, let alone saying, anything, more controversial about what to do with that sacred cow of free tuition.
Okay, great, thanks, David. So maybe there's a question here for Stuart as well, if that's okay, because Stuart, so you've talked a bit about the link between cutting tax and growing revenues, or increasing tax and growing revenues, and I guess the question about where are we on the Laffer curve. So there's someone who's put a really interesting question in there, which I think builds on some of your comments about, well, what happens if you were to cut different rates of taxation, and would this be revenue raising over time? So could you maybe just explain, I guess, where your thinking is when you make the judgment calls on some of the parties, for example, cutting taxation, how might that feed through to revenue?
Yeah, so there is a huge amount of research on this, also a huge amount of uncertainty. One thing I would say is that, let me say a couple of things. First of all, the Laffer curve is real, it exists. There comes a point where raising taxes rate starts to reduce revenue. The question is, where are we on that curve? Are we at that point? And there isn't only one Laffer curve. There's actually a separate Laffer curve for every tax policy instrument that you might use. Now, for the top rate of income tax in Scotland, best estimates we've got suggest we might be around the top of the Laffer curve. It is, as I said, possible, though not certain, that cutting the top rate might raise some revenue. So, as I say, there's a lot of uncertainty around that. Elsewhere, it seems much less likely. And certainly, I mean, as I said, that the reform claim that their fairly wide-ranging income tax cuts would stimulate economic activity, change behaviour enough to pay for itself, just doesn't look right at all. I mean, the magnitudes are way off. And to be very clear about that, in that case, that's not not primarily because some disagreement about how much tax cuts increase economic growth. There is room for disagreement about that, but actually even on their own terms, Reform just get the arithmetic wrong on this one. They compare a cumulative thing with an annual thing, and they've just got the arithmetic wrong. There's no way on earth that's going to be true. So in general, no, we are not, as a general matter, at all probably even near the top of the Laffer curve. In general, increasing tax rates will raise revenue, although less revenue than if no one responded at all, because it does have some effect on disincentivizing activity. Conversely, cutting taxes isn't as expensive as you might think, because it has beneficial effects on spurring economic activity, but it doesn't generally pay for itself. But it really varies case by case. Some taxes, like as I mentioned, the top rate of income tax, also possibly the top rate of LPTT, looks like it may be one where if you cut it, it might pay for itself. But there's quite a lot of uncertainty around the specific estimates of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Stuart. So one thing, there's a question here about regional governance and local devolution. And I think that's one of the things that has been quite interesting and that's risen up the agenda in Scotland is, I guess, devolution from Edinburgh out to city regions and local authorities and a new fiscal arrangement there. So there's a question here about what are the potential opportunities to that? So what's driving this consensus? And are there any big differences between the parties? I don't know who wishes to take that one.
So I might come in here briefly. So Labour, in their manifesto, talk about having sort of like regional authorities in Scotland, a little bit like there are combined authorities in England, whether that have mayors or not. You know, a mayor of Greater Glasgow and a mayor of the Lothians, I'm not sure. But they sort of suggest that. Now, in England, the kind of debate very much is around two things. I guess one is local accountability, that local politicians are more directly accountable to their local voters and can kind of, you know, deliver more tailored services based on local preferences. And particularly that's a push for mayors that kind of they're like a figurehead, and that helps with accountability too. And the other argument is around growth, actually, that not just because of actually the potential for better decisions, but actually to some extent the fact where decisions are made can influence where other organizations choose to have high level activities, can sometimes play a role in that. So we've seen kind of people suggest, you know, that could be a case actually if there's more decisions being taken in Manchester, say, that actually it makes more sense for kind of top corporate people to be in Manchester as well, closer to where those decisions are happening. In Scotland, you know, clearly Scotland is nowhere near as big as England, you know, certainly not population-wise, although geographically it's not such a big difference. But, you know, I think the key question in Scotland is perhaps less around that kind of growth angle where, you know, Edinburgh, you know, the main population centres in Scotland are all pretty close to Edinburgh. If there was a case for an area being a bit out of the way, it's perhaps, you know, the kind of Highlands and Islands or Aberdeenshire. But, you know, the central belt is all pretty tightly packed together. I think the kind of question is more around accountability over local services. One of the things we've seen, despite this recent Butte House agreement between the local government and central government, a slow centralization of decision making over how local government spending is allocated. So, more and more of it being not necessarily ring fenced, but earmarked for whether it's increasing pay for public sector workers in the councils, or for social care workers, or for school pupil numbers, or so on. So I think, yes, I think there is a kind of question about should there be, decentralization of whether it is economic functions or more service functions back down to local decision makers.
Great. Excellent. Well, thanks for that, David. So we've got just one final minute to go and then we'll wrap up. So one slightly unfair question to each of you, and I'll go around in the order that you spoke. So let's suppose you wake up a week on Friday and you're advising the next finance secretary of the new Scottish government. What's the one question or action that you would like to put to them to take forward on day one? So I'll come to you first, David. What would you be your first piece of advice or your first challenge to the new finance minister?
So my first piece of advice is actually going to be two separate pieces, if I can, very cheekily. One is 2027-8 budget. That's looming. You need to make some cuts in this budget. Let's start planning this now, and let's not just try to do a salami slicing approach to the budget, because this needs to be done right. And this might involve actually postponing some of your pledges until the budget situation is a little bit better. And the second actually is, if you're going to do a tax strategy like the last Scottish government did, don't do it at the end of your term. Actually set it out at the start so that you have a clear plan for tax over the kind of course of a whole parliament, rather than it being a sort of series of ad hoc changes and then you come up with a plan with a year to go to the next election. Okay, thanks, David. And then Stuart?
So I'm going to pick out something specific, which would be from what would be in my tax strategy, which is proper property tax reform. Actually grasp the nettle on taking council tax, taking land and buildings transaction tax, and replacing them with a single tax that is, proportional or nearer proportional to an up-to-date measure of property values, without the transaction tax element that discourages people from moving. I think that would be the single biggest and best thing you could do to improve the Scottish tax system.
Okay, thanks, Stuart. And then finally, Tanya.
Yeah, so if I had to be specific, I would advise to focus early on growth and in particular labour market inactivity. So we've had some discussion about how to go and increase the tax intake by playing around with different tax rates. Another approach is get more people working. More people working, don't play around with anything, will increase the tax rates. And that's about expanding the effective labour supply. It's about improving productivity. It's about getting people back into work. And that's what I would suggest to the Finance Minister.
Thanks, Tanya. Well, that brings us to the end of this webinar. So can I just thank the three of you, David, Stuart and Tanya, for your insights, both in terms of your presentations, but also your way you engage with the thoughtful questions from everyone. It's very much appreciated. And it's great to have this sort of analytical rigor going into scrutinising the party manifestos. From the Centre for Public Policy, the next election webinar is at noon on Thursday. We'll be looking in more detail at polling and public attitudes, and that's going to be in partnership with Ipsos. So you can see details of that if you follow through on the QR code there. You can sign up for that. You can find out what we're doing on the Centre for Public Policy website, and you can see all the various election work that's going on in these final couple of weeks. For me, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to be able to host you. I hope you found this as informative as I have, and look forward to seeing you all very soon. Thank you.